The next speaker will be Dr. Paul Greenham. He is a former academic and currently works in high tech in Tel Aviv in some firm. And Paul initially came to Israel as a postdoc on a previous Israeli fellowship and subsequently made Aliyah with his family here. He is a Newton expert, and his doctoral dissertation compared Newton research methods in alchemy and in theology. He has a contract with Oxford University Press to turn his work into an accessible book, which is called Newton and the Symbolic World. You're welcome.
Hello everyone, thank you for having me. Adir, thank you for inviting me. It's a great opportunity to have a chance to jump back into the academic world. As our chair announced, I am now actually working in high tech, but I did my PhD on Isaac Newton and I was a postdoc at Tel Aviv University. And actually Steve Snowden was on my PhD committee. And so I still want to bring to you some of my insights onto in Newton's work as an alchemist. And however, what I'm going to be focusing on is actually Newton as a reader of alchemical books. So first of all, let's just look a little bit at what we know of Newton. And we've actually had a change of perspectives of who was Isaac Newton. Now, Steve talked to us about how right after Newton's life, he was actually seen in this sort of the clockwork universe, the God who's made the universe. And it was kind of, he was subsumed into an Enlightenment view, which is where here we have creation and God is not involved in this creation. And a lot of the sort of more was perceived non-enlightened aspects of Newton's thought were put to the side. And we've talked about that with theology. I'm going to be talking about that as alchemy. However, subsequently to that, you had the discovery of Newton's documents, which we've talked about, which Adir has brought to us. And with that, there's been a change in perspective. And to some degree, there's this mystical Newton. And it's embodied in John Maynard Keynes' description of Newton as the last of the magicians. So Keynes was giving a presentation, he was writing it, and it was actually presented after his death, on Newton. And he said Newton is not this beginning of the Enlightenment, but actually we should see him as the final person in a line of Babylonians and Sumerians, of magi, of magicians. So we have the last of the magicians as this view of Newton. And this kind of view of Newton was continued a little bit through some authors. You may have read the Newton biography by Richard Westphal called Never at Rest. It's a large volume. You may also have read The Janus Faces of Genius by Dobbs. And basically what they're looking at was sort of seeing this Newton and trying to bring in, incorporate, how do we get what's sort of the mystical parts of Newton, the heresy, the interpretation of end times, and of course the alchemy, and how do we reconcile that with his science. And so Dobbs has this grand unifying theory that in all things that he is doing, Newton is seeking after the thoughts of God. So this is sort of what I might call the second wave of Newtonian scholarship. And actually we're getting to almost a third wave where it's mirroring some developments in the history of science, which says, you know what, some of those things that we're talking as mystical and as not having anything to do with science may actually not have been mystical in the minds of the people who practiced them. And alchemy is a very strong area in which we can see this recovery of the image, perhaps, of these hermetic and mystical actions that people in the past did. And so we're shifting away from this perspective, and it's one of the things that's called the new historiography of alchemy. And one of the things that we see with the new historiography of alchemy is, well, when we look at alchemy, it's not the pseudoscience that we thought it was. In fact, it has a theoretical and experimental strength. In some ways, it's not chemistry as we know it, but it's not based on sort of just you may have this image of the alchemist with kind of a pointy hat with maybe stars on it, and he's in his lab, a little bit Harry Potter-esque, pouring this thing into that and pouring that into this, and sort of he's maybe cackling. Sort of this might be your image of the alchemist. Whereas actually there's a deep theoretical basis for alchemy. And throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, in fact, alchemy was one of the most experimental activities available. People would go into labs, they had theories, and they would be testing them in their laboratories. And so this new perspective, this new historiography of alchemy is saying, when we think about alchemy, let's not look at it the way we see alchemy, but let's look at it in the perspective of the people who lived at that time. How did they perceive alchemy? And really up until the 1700s, so throughout sort of Newton's first 60 years of life, alchemy was seen as a very viable pursuit of natural philosophy, of knowing not quite natural philosophy, of knowing the natural world. And so one of the things that we also see with alchemy is it's described as bookish, experiential, and experimental. So this is actually another feature that we're seeing in concepts of the history of science, is a movement towards saying, actually, the study of books and the interpretation of books was a very central part of what early modern people did. So early modern people, so Newton going to university, would have learned the classics. He would have learned Greek and Latin. He would have read Homer. He would have read Cicero. And everybody who we think of as a scientist at that period actually learned the methods of interpretation. Interpretation is central to what they were doing. And this is true also for alchemy. There's a lot of alchemical books that were written. And so before you can go into the lab, you need to read the alchemists from the past, figure out what they're doing, and try to recreate their experiments and move forward. Of course, one of the issues with alchemy, and one of the reasons why it has received this mystical magician's hat kind of reputation, is because a lot of it is written cryptically. It's written in kind of codes or using allegorical language that sound, when the modern reader looks at it, it really does look like a spell book. But actually, if you look back at the way that people were practicing then, they were translating. They're seeing this written set of symbols, and we'll see this in Newton's own writing. This set of descriptions or allegory is actually a description of how to do a chemical experiment. And if you can translate it from the symbols into the chemistry or the alchemy, the terms, the sort of the twin doves of Diana are actually this silver compound. And when the volcano erupts a stone and Saturn eats the stone, or the eagle eats the stone, it's actually a chemical reaction that's having some kind of effervescent bubbling, and there's some behavior happening. So you actually, when you look back at these texts, there's a lot more rationality behind them, but it's been coded, because the alchemists always said, well, it's not, we code it because we don't want the unworthy masses to be able to interpret it and use it. However, what you have is this sense of we need to read the books, and then we can go into the laboratory. And I was actually thinking about it, this still happens today. If you go into a science lab, you will have a laboratory, but you'll also have a little office. And in that office, you will have probably some graduate students who are busy poring over the scientific journals, underlining things, we need to try this method, we need to do this sort of thing. We actually do see going through the texts of the day, finding out what you need to use, and then going into the laboratory. It's a similar process. Now, of course, perhaps for some of us, the modern scientific journals are more accessible than the allegorical magician spellbook type things of the past. But for others who look at disciplines that are not in their field, they look just as arcane, I'd say. Nonetheless, let's look at Newton himself. And here's a picture of Newton in the Trinity College chapel. So Newton and alchemy. Newton started alchemy fairly early in his life. So his dates, he was born in 1642, went to Cambridge in 1661. And he was actually, this was during his period in his master's level. And this is the picture from modern day Cambridge. And this is actually looking at his rooms. We're probably right here. And here's a graft from the apple tree that was taken from Woolsthorpe Manor, and they planted it here in Newton's honor. And here we actually have a picture of Trinity College from the time period when Newton lived there, from Logan's Cantabrigia Illustrata. So this building here is actually the Trinity College Chapel. You can still go inside it, and it's still remaining from here. And you can see the gate is on this side. There's some towers, and that's this gate here. And then here we actually have Newton's room. Now, I was actually chatting with Steve last night about, there's a question of where was Newton's alchemical lab? And some people think, well, there's this little shed over here. Maybe, you know, he came out, stepped out here, and he did this, and he's got little plants and things he can pick and, you know, grind into his materials and that sort of thing. Although, as Steve was saying, it seems a little bit small to have 2 furnaces and the full action. So maybe the lab is somewhere else. We're not exactly sure. But you can actually see this is where he was conducting it. And so we have a record in his, his notebook of things he bought. And he buys a furnace, and he also buys a copy of what's called the Theatrum Chemicum, which is a 7-volume, multi-volume text of sort of collecting various alchemical or chemical texts. And this work of his, the alchemical work, preoccupies much of his work throughout the 1670s to the 1690s. In fact, you could say that all of what we consider sort of his discoveries in optics, his physics, these sorts of things, these were distractions and side projects. The Principia, the optics, were distractions and side projects from his real work, which was alchemy and theology. So he'd stop them, and then he'd be forced into correspondence with other natural philosophers, and fine, you're asking me this question, I'll send a letter up to you, now let me get back to my furnace. So if we look at a lot of his writings, it's coming through here. Now, this period seems to end, his interest in alchemy seems to end when he moves to London in 1696. And so there's been some discussions of this is the late phase of Newton's alchemy and the end of his alchemy. He moves to London, he becomes a warden, and then later master of the mint. However, I actually think that perhaps his alchemical studies did not end when he became part of the mint, but it was transformed, because if you think about what is happening in a mint, it's the production of gold. It's actually using metallurgy, it's using these tools. So I think, in some degree, it might be, actually, Westphal in his biography says that they hired him as the warden because they didn't know about his alchemical stuff, and if they had, there's no way they would have hired him. I actually wonder if they hired him because, I mean, there's all sorts of political reasons why he got the job, but he was actually seen as an expert on how to work with metals, on how to produce these sorts of things. And so I think his alchemical background gave him good experience in this area. So what I want to look at, and I need to hurry here because of our time, we're going to look at some of his sources, and specifically his library. So Adir has helpfully talked us through the story of the manuscripts, but Newton had a large library of books that he read avidly. So if we look here, here's a picture of Newton. This is actually a death mask. So when he died, they put plaster of Paris on his face. And this is at the Trinity College Library. And so when he died, there was about 1,900 volumes, and it was worth £270. And it was cataloged. So we have a catalog of it. And this library was purchased by John Huggins for about £300. And he wanted to set up his son, Charles Higgins, as a rector, which is a clerical position in Oxfordshire. So this was a great way to, instead of building up a library individually, you can actually just buy it wholesale. And it had the added benefit of having lots of theological books in it, which was great for a rector. And then over time, it actually passed to James Musgrave, who was, I think, a nephew-in-law of Huggins. And it was moved to Barnsley Park. So we can actually see the movement of the books across time. And after this, it was actually, it seems to have been forgotten a bit that the original owner of these books was Isaac Newton. And they were sold at an auction in 1920, and the entire lot was sold for £170. So if you can think of inflation, it was initially sold for 300 back in 1727, and now we've moved forward 150 years, and it's sold for 100 and something less pounds. So the value of this library is completely unknown. And it was dispersed. A lot of booksellers bought them. Some people realized these are Newton's books, but they didn't tell the seller, so they could buy them and then upsell them. And the problem with this is, of course, a lot of books have been lost. One example is that initial purchase, the Theatrum Chemicum, which was described in the initial catalog as full of annotations from Isaac Newton. So you can imagine the value of getting a book like this where you have all of Newton's writings on it. Some of the books were not sold, about 500 to 600. that were left in the Musgrave collection and were eventually donated to the Wren Library, which is this collection here. And actually, a lot of these books are those books themselves. And if you look here carefully, that's the death mask sitting on the shelf. So when you're at the Wren Library, there's Newton looking at you as you study. Anyway, so we can identify Newton's books through certain plates. So this one is the Huggins plate. So anything that was in the Huggins collection had that Huggins plate put on it. And this is, let's see, they're Barnsley. So this is the Musgrave plate. So we call them Huggins plate and Musgrave plate. And these plates, I don't want to toot Steve's horn, but actually when he was in Huntington Library, he discovered a couple books that had these plates in them that the library didn't know were of Newtonian provenance. So sort of, they had these books ready, and then they discovered these were books that Newton owned, which was really valuable, as we'll see why. So this is the composition of his library, thanks to Harrison, who's written a nice work on the Library of Isaac Newton. Now, some of these categories are more fluid. You might say as something that is maybe astronomy could also fit with mathematics, or some of these things go together. So you can see, or medicine and anatomy could also be alchemy, chemistry. But if you look at this, the top two stand out, right? Especially theology. 27% of his library was strictly sort of theological, church history, commentaries, that sort of thing. Then we see alchemy or chemistry is next up. Then we have classical literature. Then we have history. And only here, number 5, do we see something that might resemble what we would call science or scientific today. And then we have reference, travel, and down here, medicine, anatomy, physics, which included his optical work, philosophy. Of course, this is where John Harrison has a bit of a distinction, because I would say philosophy at that time actually included all of these studies. And we can see, so all these different types of works. And so you can see here, alchemy and chemistry are over here. There are about 70 of these alchemical books at the Wren Library. And I went through these books searching for some aspects, some sense of how did Newton read these books. So if we look inside them, looking at Newton as a reader, there's 2 features that we see. The first of them is annotation. So Newton has written in the margins. So you can see here, here's a nice marginal note. It's actually, he's got this is a code in Latin. And here he's written for you the way to do the code. So here's 5 letters. If there's an A, change it to a U. If there's an E, change it to an O. If there's an L, change it to a A, I think, something like that. So you can see this little code he's written to help him read it. Also, you see up top here, he's got references. So here is one work, and here's a reference to another work. So you can have marginal notes and general commentary. You also have bibliographical notes. So this book is also in this position. This was written by this person. You sometimes have manuscript corrections. If there's something, often errors, you'll see he's quite meticulous. You get a sense of the kind of person Newton is as you go through these. And also you see changes, emendations. This is especially true of Newton's own books that he owned in the library. So his copy of the Principia, his copy of the Optics, he actually writes in it and changes it. So another aspect that we see, however, are dog ears. And a lot of work has been done looking at these manuscript notes, but not as much has been looked at the dog ears. So one of the features you see as you go through Newton's library is a lot of books have either the page turned down, or if you can see here, an indication that the page used to be turned down. Now, when we think of it, we actually see this as not a very good habit. It's bad for the book, right? How could such a great man as Newton be treating his book so badly? You might think that, right? Especially if any of you are librarians here, you might see these dog ears and be like, horrors, like dog ears. However, Newton used these in a specific way. And it's somewhat unusual. We do see it elsewhere, but it's quite unusual to him. And it's across, we see them across the subject, but alchemy, the alchemical books, have a very high precedence of the dog ears. And in fact, the book that talks about Newton's library doesn't, I think, give us justice to how much of the dog earing we see. And this is an unexplored area of Newton scholarship. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the dog ears. So if we look at his method, here we have a book called Mystagogus. It's an alchemical work that was given to Newton, actually quite late in his life, but we see he still read through it. So he obviously didn't completely abandon alchemy when he moved to London. And at the cover, he has these 3 things. It says Willis and his Search of Causes, page 3 and page 21. If we turn to page 3, here we actually, I don't know if you can see it, there's a line here. Do you see that? So at one point, there was a dog ear right there. Now what's interesting is actually if you were to virtually or physically turn this dog ear down, it points at something. So here we have this thing. It turns down like this and points at what's written here, Willis and his search of causes. So here we have up top, he's written it. It's a system of referencing. And the dog ear actually points down, and the corner of the ear points at the aspect that he's referencing. So we can see it in multiple different areas. Here we have a copy of a pretty important alchemical text that he wrote. It's called Praxis. And at the bottom here, it's a bit hard for you to see, but it says basically he's talking about the dragon, which cannot be, doesn't die unless slain by his brother and sister, who are the sun and moon. And he quotes Meyer, Emblemata 25. And so here, it's a little bit fuzzy, but this is the book, this is Meyer's book, which is in his library. It's his emblems, which is sort of, he goes through different pictures and explains how there's an alchemical meaning behind each of these emblems. And this is number 25. And here we have the dragon being killed by the sun and the moon. Okay, and if we turn to the next page, over here, we actually have the direct quotation that is here written out. So you can imagine Newton going through his works, he's reading the books, he's folding the pages, and he's using that to write his alchemical compositions. So much of his alchemy is actually quotations compiled together. And some of the question is, what's he doing with this? Why is he doing it this way? And so what I looked at was I saw various patterns to the dog ears. Some are references to other alchemical works. So you might have a dog ear sort of see also in this thing written. The dog ear will point at that. Quite a lot of them are that. Some are direct quotations that he might want to be using in his writing. Some are procedural methods or descriptions of experimental products. This is what you do. You take it, you shake it around for a little bit, you bury it for 60 days, you get it back up again, you burn it here. Actual procedures, and we have the dog ears to that. Some, and also experimental products, so this thing should be this thing. And then what's interesting though is we also see some deciphering. Sometimes he says, like I said, the dragon's mother and sister, or brother and sister, are the sun and the moon, and might also have sort of, this is gold and silver, or something like that. You may have this sort of, this symbol actually means this thing. So we have Newton going through deciphering the symbolic language of alchemy. And some other, similar to this one, the meaning behind mythological symbols or stories in alchemical procedures. So that's what we have here. It has Latonum of the sun and the moon, or Apollo and Diana, which is this. And then it says, this one is basically, I can't quite get it, but it says it's one of the 12 hieroglyphic gods of the Egyptians. So he's going through these gods of the Egyptians and saying, these myths we can actually see as alchemical code language for these materials that we're using. So you can kind of imagine him going through his library, dog-earing, folding, making notes, and then going into the laboratory and performing some of those experiments. But it goes the other way around. Sometimes he might not know what these symbols mean, and he actually goes to the laboratory and tries to figure out the symbol. So there's an example here where he's actually using, he's talking about an experiment he's been doing, right? I understood there are certain sublimations, this is mercury, of mercury. This is also the other doves. So he's trying to think, what are these two doves? To be sure, the sublimate, this is sort of what comes out, it sort of settles in the bottom, right? Is the only feculent that sends white from its own bodies, the black residue left behind in the bottom, which is washed away by solution. Very chemical sounding language. And the mercury is sublimed again from the cleansed bodies until the residue no longer remains in the bottom. So this is more of this. And then he says, and this is right here, you can see it here, would not this most purified sublimate be this funny symbol here? And this is a symbol for something called the Caduceus. It's the rod that Mercury, the god Mercury, holds. And so he's trying to do some experimentation to figure out what is this symbol. It's used in alchemy. When this alchemist refers to it, what is it? And he's going through his experimentation. He's following the procedures. He's like, maybe this sublimate that comes out is the Caduceus. Okay, and then he actually has here, states with more certainty, the Caduceus of mercury is certainly a double, this is a symbol for vitriol, fermenting crude white antimony. And these 10 dimetallic principles are not fused and have an affinity amongst themselves, as is evident from the regulus of iron and the net as well as mercury. And so this is basically descriptions of it. And he's saying, now I'm pretty sure what the Caduceus is. Here's the Caduceus. So we can actually see also in his research, he compiles a list of all the different items, objects you'll see in alchemy. He's called it index. He calls it the index chemicus. And he lists all the places where the quotation, you can find it in quotation, and he gives possible options for what these different things are. So if you want to know what is the caduceus, it actually does remain in modern symbolism. And I'll show it to you right here. In the symbol for pharmacies, this here is a mercury stuff. You can see the mercury's wings. And right here are those two snakes, if you recall, the two snakes that had to fight each other. We have it here, this symbol. And I say this because we think of sort of alchemy as this historic, ancient thing, this mystical practice. And I like to say alchemy birthed chemistry. So chemistry is a child of alchemy. It's not the same thing as alchemy. But alchemy became pharmacy. And if you can think about mixing these compounds, a lot of pharmaceutics that were done at that time was actually under the umbrella of alchemy. So alchemy birthed chemistry, but became pharmacy. It's still with us today. Every time you go to the pharmacist, you're actually going, and in English, in British English, you have the word the chemist. You go to the chemist. Why is he called the chemist? Because he's actually the alchemist that you're going to get your medicine. So all of you are interacting with alchemists all the time, still, today. I don't have much more time, so I just wanted to say what we see here in Newton's reading and the way he's using his dog ears is a translational hermeneutic, a way of interpretation which is translational based. It's according to languages. He sees a language of symbolism. He creates an index which is a dictionary, and he needs to find out what is the meaning. If we can just translate this thing to this thing, then we can actually read in plain meaning the sense. And you actually see this also in his reading of scripture. He says we need to interpret, specifically reading of prophecy. He says the symbols in prophecy, the dragon, the beast, the rain falling on these things, the king, so like seven-headed beast, all these different strange apocalyptical images actually are a language that the ancient prophets spoke. It was separate, of course, from the common tongue. And if we can just decipher all of these and translate them, then we can read it plainly as a kind of a future history of what's going to happen. So this is something we see in Newton, this principle. And one thing I'm intrigued by is, do we see this translational principle also in his mathematics being the language of the natural world? We actually see this principle across the board of trying to translate into symbolic language. And of course, mathematics has a symbolic element, these elements that he's studying. So thank you for your time. Well, I would say that the very beginning of chemistry had a very different concept. They didn't have the atomic theory. So just as chemistry has evolved, so has alchemy/pharmacy. Yes, he did. And he was constantly searching after the philosopher's stone, because this is the ultimate goal of alchemy, is transmutation. Can I turn something into gold? But it seems, for some strange reason, that he never reached the philosopher's stone. But he was trying. He tried for 20 years or more. He does write it down. We've got a number of chemical laboratory books where he talks about it. A lot of it seems to be, well, here are some people who claim to be alchemists, and they claim to have gotten the philosopher's stone. So let me try to sort of recreate these experiments to get there. And maybe I was misinterpreting these symbols that they're using. Of course, the problem with alchemy is there's a lot of fraud in it, and some people claiming to be alchemists and use a lot of the language to kind of just pretend to do what they can't do, which is part of the discrediting of the field in general. But Newton definitely writes about it, but he never achieved the goal of transmutation, unfortunately, for modern science. Yes?
Does Newton write why the fact there should be a stone that makes gold as opposed to a stone that makes zinc or a copper? What was special about gold that stone should be?
Okay, so it gets deeply into alchemical theory. But gold was seen, all metals were seen as a balance of two pieces. There's mercury and sulfur. And so every metal is actually some combination of that. And there's a perfect balance, which gold contained. And the others were unbalanced. So copper had too much sulfur, too much fire in it, for example. Silver was very close, but had a little bit too much mercury in it, so that's why this is the white. And gold was the perfect balance. So you've got this kind of, it's almost a living sort of sense. The alchemical view of the world sees it as this alive, as this breathing. And it's similar to the humoral, the medical way of understanding people at the time. You have these balances of these different humors. It's the same way you're actually healing your metal by converting it into gold. You're healing the imbalances in the metal. So it's part of the theory. It goes back quite a ways. And of course, gold is more valuable, so of course that one's the... And why was it originally chosen? I don't know, but the alchemy Newton inherited had that theory, with gold as that central place. Yeah.
So new diamonds which are produced as a type of
New diamonds?
yes, those artificial diamonds.
I mean, actually, by modern science, alchemy is possible because you just need to change a proton, and you will actually transmute something. The problem is simply changing an atom to have an extra or less protons is not a very easy procedure, right? So in theory, transmutation is actually possible, but it's not economical. Pardon?
It has to be done atom by atom.
Exactly, yeah. Yes. There. Yes.
Algebra is the mathematical discipline today.
Yeah.
Maybe alchemistry was the first discipline calling the chemistry.
Absolutely. And to an extent that we can see continuity between what we have today and in the past, I would agree with that. But we often, so we look at physics today, and we say, oh, someone 400 years ago is doing physics.
Yeah, but we use the
But,
concept of alchemistry or chemistry.
well, that's the thing, is that before around 1720, alchemy and chemistry were kind of interchangeable. There wasn't a distinction made. So if you were doing what looks more like chemistry to us, it would still be called chemistry with a Y, chemistry, or it could be called alchemy. Or if you're more focused on the spiritual aspects and the inner transformation, that could also be called alchemy. So there's kind of, it wasn't as sharply divided, but you had some more laboratory theory-focused alchemists and some more spiritual self-improvement, transformation of the object meets the transformation of my soul, that kind of alchemist. And you had...
But when he writes on alchemistry or chemistry, the word itself.
What does he use?
Yeah.
He will use them, he'll use both. The common word is chemistry with a Y. Chemistry, two Ys, if you imagine. And actually the new historiography of alchemy says we should just use that word. That's what they use, and it removes the confusion. Pardon? He doesn't distinguish as much. You'll see sometimes he'll say he is no true chemist. Sometimes he'll say he is no true alchemist. It's...
So then we do a lot of wrong for it, because at that time we didn't know anything about nuclear energy.
Exactly.
Alchemistry is the only transmutation method at that time to make by energy change the material from one type to another type.
But he was trying to deeply investigate the atomic theory, because of course you did have the atomic theory at the time. And he was, his matter theory does go into kind of division of atom and how most of an atom is actually space. And the part of it that is matter is very small. And you can imagine like cutting it, and even that, he does this like, you can recreate it as sort of like a cube. You know, one cube of it is actually the matter part. And we go into that cube, only one cube of that is actually matter, and the rest is just occupying space. And sort of, it's called the nutshell theory, the idea that actually all the real matter in the universe, like the true physical matter, could probably be squeezed into a nutshell. And the rest is just occupying space with forces and that sort of thing. So he does kind of develop that theory, but it's almost like he misses a step in that he jumps to the atom and the atomic level before he deals with the elemental level. So what happens in chemistry is you have Dalton and the theory of the elements. You actually need that distinction first before you can go back into the atomic stage. Yeah, I think, okay. Yeah. That's a good question. He's asking, do you detect a sense of frustration in his writings? After 20 years, he still hasn't reached it. I'm not sure, because Newton's goal with transmutation is not to actually get rich on making gold. His goal is to understand how the universe works, right? And so it seems to me that it has given him some insights. And there's some discussion on the idea of action at a distance. Was that made possible by alchemical ideas rather than a mechanical, everything has to touch itself? Whereas some motions in alchemy can happen through affinities. So maybe the action at a distance, the idea of even how gravity works, could have been inspired by this. That's a debated theory. So there could be some aspects in which, yes, he never quite reached the transmutation, and it's possible that his seeming abandonment of alchemy in his late 40s, could indicate this, but he does continue to dabble in it. And like I said, at the Mint, one of the times he actually boasts, that he knows a better way to purify gold. So I don't see a specific aspect in his writing, but I think you can still make a case that maybe he gets tired of it after a while. Or other things take his attention. The political machinations of running the Royal Society and suppressing opponents and this sort of thing occupies his his mind more. Politics, exactly. Good. I think I can talk to you after. Thank you.